right? The tariff raises tax revenue for the government. It also makes it harder for foreign companies and foreign products to be sold in the U.S. because they're now more expensive. Which means, the example I gave last week was like, maybe that tariff now makes the BMW more expensive than a Cadillac, and so now I'm more likely to buy a Cadillac. And so I'm still going to pay about the same amount for a car, right? The BMW itself might cost more, but a car still costs me the same, which means I don't actually face any inflation on my cost of living and my expenses. Welcome to Service and Wealth, the podcast dedicated to helping military personnel master their finances and achieve financial freedom. Our mission is to guide you through the ins and outs of planning, saving, and investing, and most importantly, how to balance savings so you can enjoy life now and retire with confidence. Welcome back to the show. This is your host, Ted Ehlert, here with the Military Wealth Coach and our Service and Wealth podcast. I guess it's not that original to call it Service and Wealth podcast because we also called our first book that, but I like the way that those two things go together. If you've read the book at this point, I want to obviously say thanks to everybody who has, and especially those who have, given some feedback and also, put the word out there and shared the book with their fellow service members or their family. And, we've had a few sales, which is pretty neat. It's always exciting when you get that email from Amazon saying like, hey, check it out. People are reading what you're putting out there. But also, fundamentally and philosophically, that's sort of what when I came in as a young officer, I left a job working as a banker in New York City, working on Wall Street, and took a pretty massive pay cut, as you might imagine. But I really wanted to serve, and I really wanted to go off and fight. I wanted to be a Marine, and it was something I was really passionate about, and I believed in it way more than I believed in a paycheck or making money at that point. And as you get older, though, you start to realize, like, well, belief and pride and doing something, self-sacrifice and all that, it doesn't pay the bills. It doesn't put a roof over your head. It doesn't keep the car running. It doesn't make people around you happy by, and money is just a thing that lets you live the life you want, right? Like, sure, you can say, I don't need a big paycheck. I'm happy to let my partner stay at home. We'll be a one paycheck family. We can pay the bills. Our savings rate is going to be the same as the average American savings rate, which is like 3%, which means, we just have to work for 82 years before we can afford to retire. And retirement is like financial freedom. That's when you don't have to work in order to pay the bills. And if you want to do that for 82 years, like, that's great, whatever. If you want to do it work less and have your freedom sooner, most people, they start work around between the age of 18 and 23, and they're hoping to retire between the age of 62 and 67, and that's, that plays out in the average age of retirement in the United States, where the average woman retires about 62 and the average man retires about age 66. So they're looking to work about half as long as you have to if you're saving 3%. Like, most people plan, they're like, I'm going to work for 40 to 45 years. Well, if you're like me, once you get, to have a family and you get in your 30s and 40s and you're looking back at 15 to 20 years of working and you're like, wait, I got to do that much all over again and then just hope that I'm going to make it. That sounds like a raw deal, and working for 20 years only to realize, like, you got to transition and go sign up to do it for another 20 years or 25 years or maybe 30 years, sort of like turns the lights on and reality hits you and you're like, man, I probably should have been saving and investing a lot more over my life so that I didn't have this sort of sentence hanging over my head. And the end of my career drew near, I got into like the final 5 years, and I realized like there had to be other plans in place, and that's when I also came to realize that like it's kind of self-destructive to think that it's all this in a paycheck, or it's not about the money. It has to be. You have to find within yourself this sort of acceptance and belief that like you can do something so selfless and so courageous and so honorable and noble that you're willing to go off to war and die for your country, your family, your friends, your neighbors, your beliefs, and also that you can use it as a pathway to financial freedom, which is, again, financial freedom's no weird mystic concept. It's just literally when you don't need to work in order to pay the bills and live the life you want, And so, as we've talked a few times, and we introduced, I can't remember what episode it was, but we introduced a little bit of what we call the iCash budgeting method, which instead of starting with like, listing your expenses and listing your income and subtracting expenses from income and finding out how much you have over, it starts one step sooner with identified dreams and goals. And it's like, what do I want my life to look like? What do I want to be able to afford? Where do I want to live? What kind of house do I want to have? What kind of hobbies do I want? What do my family want? And when you start from there, then you come up with a number of how much money you need to do the things you want, so that 20, 40, 60, 80 years from now, you don't look back and be like, man, I literally spent my entire life working. I took 2 weeks off every year. I used those 2 weeks off to go visit my in-laws and my parents or my cousins. I never did A, B, or C. I never got to experience, X, Y, or Z. And hopefully like that starts to resonate and starts to really show the importance of thinking about and planning about your finances and your paycheck and stuff, taking it really seriously while you're in uniform, even before you officially enlist or commission. If you're a poolee, if you're a candidate, if you're an academy, they're cadets, midshipmen, whatever. JROTC, whatever that is, like it's never too soon to start planning. And so that's why we kind of keep reinforcing this service and wealth bit. And then, the reason why I bring that up is because last week we talked a little bit about how national elections, presidential elections, congressional elections, changes in parties specifically can be, like it all comes back to the economy, right? Like we're sitting here, we're in uniform, we're like, well, I believe that, but at the same time, I have to like care about my pocketbook and how much money's in my checking account, and we kind of exposed how since 1986 and 1998, base pay and BAS respectively have by law been tied to an index. And every year, if the Congress or the president doesn't do something specific that everybody approves and agrees with, our pay raises are automatic, And so, we kind of talked about how if you want to increase your income and you want to start having more money to save so that you can invest more and do more while you're in the military, voting for one party or the other is not going to really change the future. It's tied to either the employment cost index, the ECI, or it's tied to surveys on housing. And I wanted to follow up. I got a couple comments back from a couple of my friends. So they're senior officers. They've been, I would say like they've been great friends because they've been listening to the podcast and reading the blog and stuff. But maybe they're actually interested. So I don't know. Maybe they're supporting me. Maybe it's useful. And they gave some pushback. They're like, hey, look, I'm not totally sure I agree with what you're saying. Or in one case, it was very much like, I disagree with what you're saying. And then in the other case, it was like, I'm not really sure I understand that. Can you explain it, again? And so I wanted to come back just because I think I tried to pack a lot into that episode like we always do. And So I wanted to start today's podcast with two real quick sort of like updates from last week, just to make sure we're all on the same page. And, I apologize if it was unclear what I was saying last week. I don't apologize if it was controversial or disagreeable, right? Because that's what we want. There's never any right opinion or perspective. Everybody gets their own. And that's one of the hard points about talking about politics is you get so embedded with your own ideas and your opinions. You're like, no, it's got to be this way. And, like I say time and time again when we're talking about investing and specifically like stock investing and mutual fund investing in your retirement accounts in the thrift savings plan or a 401k or individual retirement account if you have one of those. Like there is a right way. Like the numbers don't lie. You invest in a low-cost, index-based, passively managed, mutual fund in U.S. large-cap equities, the S&P 500, and you're gonna win 99 times out of 100 because that strategy is already winning 99 times out of 100. And when it comes to, just talking about like a new Trump 2.0, I guess we'll call it. Or whatever we're calling it these days. What we talked about was how pay goes up according to these indexes. And it's kind of hard to say that we're getting a pay raise when the only thing that happens with our base pay or our BAS each year is that it goes up by an index. And I'll give you an example of what I mean. So I pulled some data, and what I want to explain is, if you look at the real inflation in the U.S. economy over, we can just go back 5 years, right? And we can also go back and we can look at what the employment cost index was over the last 5 years. Now, the interesting thing to note is that if you've read our book or upcoming book, so I guess I can't say books yet. There's only one that actually you can read. We do talk about over the course of history in the U.S., over about 114 years, on average, wages go up about 2.6% per year. And on the flip side, like inflation has averaged about 3.1% per year over that same amount of time, which is why, and we try to tease out in the books, and maybe we'll have a different podcast to talk about this, which is why generation to generation, we in America don't feel like we're doing better off. If, on average, cost of living goes up 3.1% and on average wages go up 2.6%, that means each year we're getting 0.5% farther behind. We have 0.5% less money than it takes to have the same life we had last year. And so that's where you get this sort of, you would think that we would be doing better and better as time goes on, because isn't the future supposed to be progress? And everybody, as they said during the Reagan years, like a rising tide lifts all boats. Like obviously the economy's growing, there's more money, there's more technology and all that stuff, but we're not really feeling it if we're just wage laborers, right? And that includes, obviously you're not getting paid by the hour in the military, but you're still a wage earner, right? You're not making your money off investments or royalties or things like that. You're making it by working. And if we look back over the last 5 years, we had this very low sort of inflationary period coming into COVID when we had like 1.8 to 1.2% inflation, and the consumer price index or CPI, which you might have heard of, it was going up about that much, like 1.5, 2%. It was not going up a lot. In those years, the employment cost index, the ECI, went up 2.7%. So in the military, you got 2.7% raises those years. That was good. That the military was staying ahead of inflation, and that was good. But then we had, obviously, COVID come along, and we had inflation that was between 5 and 8%. And the ECI, so that was, 21, 22, 23, we had annual inflation 5, 6, 8%. And in those years, the ECI was 3, 3.5, and 3.4%. And so if everything had just gone along according to the way it's supposed to by law, then the raises in the military were actually going to be less than inflation. So now you would be falling behind. But fortunately, there's this other out. And the other out is that people in Congress who write these bills, these spending bills, and how much money goes where, they can say, oh, you know what, that's not good enough. Let's make it better. And they did. And so, there was I think it was 5%, 5.7% pay raise last year to this year. And it's going to be about the same this year to next year because it trails a little bit. They can't really make the decision until they have the data, and the data doesn't come in until the year's over. But that means, to my point last week, which is if you actually want to raise, you have to actually ask for it, even in the military, right? You can't just sit back and passively let, Congress let the ECI do its work, and now you're just keeping up with inflation. Congress can actually override it, and they can authorize a bigger pay raise. And so that's what fortunately happened, but it was still only just about enough to cover inflation, right? It was 5.7% pay raise for a year that the inflation was 5.6%. It was barely keeping up. So what that's left with, obviously is, and this was the question was I don't get how those numbers work out. I don't get their relationship. And the ECI is just how much different employers across the country have to pay their employees each year, right? So when we look back all the way since 2000, the ECI, it goes 2.6%, 3.1%, a couple of years when it was almost 4%, but then 1%, 2.5%, 3%. Pretty much each year, that trend is holding where the cost of employment is going up about 2.6% per year, which means in the military, over the course of a 20-year career, you could probably expect only about a 2.6% raise per year. So your only options to make more money through your efforts working in the military are to get promoted or to write your congressperson and say, hey, we need a real raise here in the military. You can't just keep raising our paycheck just enough to cover inflation. That's not good enough. We can't get ahead. We're working hard. We're deploying. We have partners who are raising, kids and are not able to work. So we're here on a single paycheck family, and you're only giving us 2.6%. That's not really working out. And that's sort of where I was going with that. And hopefully, putting those numbers out there and talking actual numbers helps it make sense a little bit more. And all it takes is, if there's 1.2 or 1.3 million Americans in uniform on active duty, and another million in the reserves and National Guard. Imagine if we just look at the presidential election statistics, right? There was about 140 million people who voted, and 1 out of 70 of them, or even more 1 out of 50, 1 out of 60, is in the military, right? So, if we all just sat down, opened up ChatGPT or whatever, and said hey, this is the address on my driver's license where I vote. Who are my congressional representatives? And then ChatGPT will figure it out and tell you. And then you can Google that person. You'll go straight to their website, click the contact us form, type in there, hey, I'm active duty, or I'm reserve, or I'm a National Guards person. And I'm sick and tired of my pay only going up by the ECI. That's just keeping up with inflation. We're not actually ever getting a pay raise. And, if enough of us write in, there's a good chance that all the people in Congress they'll be oh my gosh, I had 100,000 letters from Texas come in and say we need a pay raise. I had 200,000 from California saying we need a pay raise. I had 50 from Maine. I'm sure there's more people in the military than 50 from Maine. But anyway, if you do that, it can result potentially in a spending bill that has more money for wages, and now you can continue to serve, but have less stress about making ends meet, paying the bills. saving for the future, saving for retirement, buying your first house, getting a new car, helping your kid start to, I think I'm never going to say like the right thing to do is to hold your kid's hand or like not let them go through adversity, but helping kids get a fresh start, debt-free on adulthood can be life-changing, right? And you can do all that if you have more money and you save more than just 3% of your paycheck. And how much would that matter? I'm just looking at the 2024 defense bill, and they've got, let's see, $176 billion for end strength personnel. So that's a lot of money. $176 billion. There's $80 million that were set aside for enlistment bonuses in the Navy and Air Force, and also for medical pay in the Army. And on the flip side, so $176 billion set aside for personnel costs. On the flip side, it's only $32.5 billion for operations and maintenance, right? For depot level maintenance. So like, for any of you who are in what we call, in the Marine Corps and the Army, we call them like heavy junk units. So armor, light armor, aircraft, all that kind of stuff. We're always complaining about like we have no aircraft that can fly, like we have no vehicles that are operating right now. We're at 50%, we're at 70%, like stuff's always broken. And there's only, $32.5 billion going into that. And so proportionally, right, you might say, well, there's a lot of money that's being spent on personnel compared to like equipment. But there's only $80 million. Like that's a paltry amount set aside for enlistment bonuses and medical pay bonus. And so you kind of realize like it wouldn't take a whole lot, another 80 million. That's like 1/1000th of the amount of money that's spent. It's 1/1000th of the amount of money that we gave to Ukraine in 2024 to fund that proxy war between Ukraine and Russia. But for another $80 million, between you could start handing out higher pay raises. For a couple $1 billion, you could make some really meaningful changes in the lives of all our service members, and it wouldn't really cost much at all, especially compared to the fact that we spent $80 billion. That's and that's just above board, like what we admit to in Ukraine, helping the Ukrainians kill Russians and Russians kill Ukrainians and all that stuff. So, again, that, just it's an encouragement to take the time to write in and say like, hey, we need to higher pay because the amount of sacrifice and the amount of hours we put in, like it's still not quite where it needs to be, and we know that you as our senators and representatives, like you have the power to give us a better raise. And we've watched you do it over the past few years where you overwrote the ECI and put in higher percentage pay raises, and also for BAH and BAS. So that's probably enough of that. And then the other bit that I wanted to follow up on is the disagreement with some of the statements I made, because I was talking about the impacts of like what the Trump 2.0, what Trump 2.0 is saying that they're going to do economically, and then sort of the pushback from the media, places like CNN. They're saying like, oh my gosh, I can't believe we elected a guy who says he's going to put tariffs on X, Y, or Z. That's just going to drive inflation. It's going to be awful for the economy. And the argument that we made was if it's just one thing, then yes, that is true. And what I mean by that is that when you put a tariff on a thing, it just raises the cost of it, right? And what we found, this is economics literature, so you don't have to You can just trust me on it. It's really, really smart guys who've won Nobel Prizes have done this. But they looked at it, and when a tariff comes in, or it basically goes 100% through to the person buying it. And what I mean by that is, let's take the example of a $50,000 BMW under totally free trade comes into the U.S. and there's a 20% tariff, right? Like BMW is not going to be like, oh, well, so that 20% tariff would be a $10,000 tax. Tariff is a tax on the car. BMW is not going to be like, okay, we're just going to give that $10,000 to the U.S. government so that Americans can still buy our car for $50,000. The car dealership is not going to sell the car for $50,000 and then, maybe they were making $12,000 profit before, and now they're going to just make $2,000 profit and pay the $10,000 tariff to the U.S. government. No, they're all just going to raise the price of the car to $60,000. And so that's why everybody's like, oh, this is terrible, this is terrible. If we stick with our car example, and I talked about it again last week because it's a really important one, is the U.S. government, what was it, maybe like probably closer to 20 years ago, really wanted to incentivize electric cars. And so they put in 2 different sets of what are called subsidies. And subsidies are the opposite of taxes. Subsidies is where you give money back to somebody on a purchase. And Tesla is the case, right? And so for the longest time, Tesla was, if you bought a Tesla, you got a $7,500 tax credit. That's not a deduction. It's not like, when you file your taxes and you figure it out, you're like, I made $50,000, I take this deduction away, and then I get to subtract another $7,500, now I figure my taxes. No, it was a tax credit. Like literally the federal government was paying $7,500 of your taxes for you. They were giving you that money right back as cash. They were also giving about twice that much to Tesla itself, right? So Tesla, through subsidies, was able to compete and sell cars for like $35,000, $40,000 that actually cost $55,000 or $60,000, right? Because these subsidies allowed you to do it. And then the tax revenue came from tariffs on other things like the BMWs, right? So it all gets kind of mixed around. And, what I want to talk about today is a follow-up because of the disagreement with what I was saying. Essentially, my buddy was like, that's what you said is like wrong because like tariffs obviously increase prices. And if prices go up, obviously inflation goes up. And all this is bad for Americans because we can't just put tariffs, 20% tariffs on everything, right? It's not, the reason why I'm saying it's not true to say that is because it depends on what you use the money for from the tariffs, right? The tariff raises tax revenue for the government. It also makes it harder for foreign companies and foreign products to be sold in the U.S. because they're now more expensive. Which means, the example I gave last week was like, maybe that tariff now makes the BMW more expensive than a Cadillac, and so now I'm more likely to buy a Cadillac. And so I'm still going to pay about the same amount for a car, right? The BMW itself might cost more, but a car still costs me the same, which means I don't actually face any inflation on my cost of living and my expenses. Now, somebody else might go buy the BMW, and they are personally paying more. Their lifestyle costs have gone up. But then what happens with that money, right? So one thing we know is the U.S., there are more Cadillacs sold. So U.S. companies are making more money. U.S. workers have more jobs, more demand. They can get higher wages. And there's less of the foreign cars being sold. But then if the government takes that money and they, instead of just keeping it or using it for whatever, they recycle it into the U.S. economy as a subsidy, then that helps to lower costs. And so what I think is really being lost here, and it's really important to discuss, is the fact that what we're talking about, we're not talking about the populist term of like, this is protectionism, this is like anti-globalization, et cetera, et cetera. it's really, and I'm sorry, it's going to be like a chewy term, an academic term, but it's neo-mercantilism, and so, please don't just like hit stop right now and like turn off the podcast if that sounds too too gnarly or nerdy a thing to talk about. But really, all it says is that the federal government of any country should use its policies to help support the domestic economy, right? And if you say like this is protectionism, this is like anti-trade, those are negative words. But when you say mercantilism, which is what these policies really are, it's protecting. It's not isolationism and protectionism so much as it is redirecting investment into the domestic economy. And the irony is that the U.S. economy and the U.S. itself is so strong and so powerful because of those things. But we forget about it, right? We forget about it because for the past 80 years, the U.S. has been just laser focused on taking over as like the single, the central hub of the global economy, right? It started in 1944 with all the talks before World War II ended between like the Allies. If you're from New Hampshire, you might have been to Bretton Woods and know about it, or maybe just golfed there, or I don't know, went to the speakeasy in the basement there. I don't know, but we set up this whole international architecture with the United Nations, with NATO, with World Bank, with the International Monetary Fund, and with the U.S. dollar as the agreed upon global currency for trade in especially in oil and gas. And so for 80 years, we've been committed to like globalization, free trade agreements, sort of that decentralization. And so now when somebody's come in and said like, Trump specifically, he's come in and said like, wait, we got to pump the brakes. Like this has not been to our advantage. He's just talking about stuff that America did for like the first 150 years of its existence. And, specifically all the way back to, Alexander Hamilton, who I referenced him last week, but to say it again, he issued a report on manufacturers. And what he said is like, look, we are this poor farming economy. We are the number one consumers of exports from England, and we're highly dependent upon them for trade for all these important things like weapons for our military, ships for our little navy, like steel to build our railroads, finished textiles to put, not just clothing on the shelves, but to like clothe our military. Like all these things, we were dependent on England, the country we had just fought a war against, and we were going to fight another war against them within, that generation in the War of 1812. And we were dependent upon them. They were, and it was for critical supplies, critical equipment, critical resources to build our economy. And he basically came out to Congress and was like, we have got to throw tariffs on all this stuff coming from England. We have got to, and then we take the revenue from those tariffs. So yes, will it cost more for clothes made in England? Yes. Will it cost more to buy steel from England? Yes. Will it cost more to buy a gun made in England? Yes. But we'll take that extra money and we'll invest it in U.S. companies to help them grow. And then once they're established and they're grown, we can buy from them. There will not be tariffs. Things will be cheaper than buying the English stuff, and we won't be dependent upon England. And obviously Congress bought off on it, right? Because over the next, 50 years, by the middle of the 1800s, we had become an industrial powerhouse, producing more than enough steel and locomotives and ships and everything that we needed for a vast military, for settling the West, like expanding across the entire continent, becoming and growing up over then from the mid 1800s into the early 1900s to become a global power. And it was because of these things that we did. And then, so you've got essentially 2/3 of American history is using mercantilism in order to develop American industry, especially where it was tied to critical needs for national defense, shipbuilding, weapons, oil and gas, railroads, etc. And so now what we're looking at as we look ahead into the 21st century is we're in a totally new era, right? We're in the Internet of Things. We're in AI. We're in automation. We're in robotics. We're, just all you have to do is turn on the news or go to LiveLink or YouTube to watch the war in Ukraine and to see that, right now, like the single most effective weapon is a drone that has an onboard computer. So it doesn't need any targeting data from external. So it can't be jammed, right? It's totally autonomous. It is an autonomous and AI-type robot that's a suicide drone. And where are these things coming from? Well, there's a lot of them from the U.S., and they're being equipped with U.S. chips and U.S. computers and circuit boards, and that's great. But what if the only thing that we had to make these things were produced by the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSCM, in Taiwan? They make like 95% of the chips in the world right now. So it's a total monopoly. And it's the main reason why the U.S. and China are in this strategic conflict over Taiwan. And China's, just launched its second aircraft carrier. It's done amphibious landings on islands that are the same distance from China as Taiwan is from China. They've done, shows of force, and we're doing the same thing, right? And so what we're finding, and my argument is that here we are in 2024, and compared to 250 years ago or 200 years ago, even, we were totally dependent on somebody else to get our ships and our guns and our steel and all that. Right now, we're totally dependent on somebody else to get the chips and the circuit boards and the server stacks and all of that, and the energy and the power to run those things. We're dependent on other countries for it. And that's really where, to be totally honest, like, it's an academic conversation, right? Like right now I'm kind of like, what do you call it? The Lazarus, like resurrecting essentially like a college economics lecture. And so, again, if it's a little bit too, academic or whatever, I apologize. That's not the point of this podcast. The podcast is supposed to be accessible, but we can take some time out and talk about some bigger picture stuff and some more academic stuff. And this is where the problem breaks down. And, on the day after the election, I was, we're living in England, and I was watching through a VPN, I was watching CNN coverage, and they were in some diner in Pennsylvania, and they were asking people, it was basically like a MAGA supporters gathering to kind of celebrate what they were seemed to be like the certain victory for Trump 2.0, and they passed the mic around through like 15 people, and like 12 out of 15 are like, it's the economy, it's jobs, it's economy, it's jobs, it's economy, it's jobs. And what we realize, like, politically, politically in terms of like a political election or political popularity, like that's kind of all you can talk about. But in the big picture, the U.S. government's got a major challenge on its hands right now. And that's what we're talking about, which is we're going through something that's going to be even more significant in the history of, modern history of mankind and civilization than the Industrial Revolution was. It's the AI revolution. It's the semiconductor. It's the chip revolution. Sorry. And we're behind the power curve. the U.S. is behind the power curve because we've been promoting globalization. We've been promoting free trade. We've been promoting this paradigm, this set of policies, which says, hey, you know what? We're really good at, human capital stuff, like thinking and doing stuff. You're really good at making stuff. So why don't you, Taiwan, you, China, you, wherever, why don't you just make all this stuff? And what have they been doing? Well, they've been developing all the next generation technologies that are critical for defense, weapons, platforms, all that stuff, as well as that are going into everything else, cars, refrigerators, smartphones, everything else. And so we've fallen behind. And essentially what, and this is sort of, when I read it and when I look at it, what I see is Trump has a really good understanding of, people say, oh, he's a businessman. Of course he gets it. No, he understands, quote unquote, the political economy, which is the economy's not just about jobs. It links to everything else. Everything's connected. And he sees how our sort of like falling behind in terms of development of technologies, pursuing this like economic policy of free trade and globalization has brought on a lot of risk to our ability to keep up with like 5th and 6th generation fighters, the latest smart weapons, the autonomous drones and robots. We're neck and neck in a lot of those things. We're ahead in terms of ships and aircraft and radars, but we're pretty level on a lot of other weapon systems, and we're falling behind in terms of these autonomous weapon systems and robotics. And so, there's that risk. And then on the consumer side, right, like if you've got Alexa in your house, you've opened the gates to the entire world, knowing your every minute, your every habit, right? It's all that data is out there, and you have to ask yourself, like, the data is being collected, transmitted through cellular devices using chips and things that are produced in other places. And, I think from a national security standpoint, the argument is we need to have better control over that. And that's where it's going. And so, you have to kind of, I guess, just make a decision for yourself if you think it's better to, in the case of semiconductors, right? Like, do we want to continue to be going head to head with China over Taiwan? Or would we rather just build up massive semiconductor chip manufacturing, campuses around Dallas, Texas, and produce all of our own chips, and then we don't care about Taiwan, right? Then we can stop worrying about it. China can have it. Who cares? It's not really strategically important beyond the fact that they have a bunch of chips and they're close to Japan, right? So whatever. Just make up your mind. Like, I personally, if let's say I got to wake up, in 3 years, I got to wake up and read about casualty lists of my former students from the Naval Academy who have been dying in the maritime conflict, on the oceans and in the air and on the islands in the Western Pacific because we're fighting China over semiconductors in Taiwan. Like, I'm personally going to be pretty heartbroken. I would much rather see a headline says like China occupies Taiwan peacefully and America doesn't care, right? But that's that's my opinion. But then I just want to wrap up by circling back to using actual numbers to explain why I disagree with the statements that you're seeing, the criticisms of tariffs, of Trump tariffs. And here's just one like really kind of spooky coincidence of numbers, but the tariffs that Trump has said he's going to implement are through what's this group called the Tax Foundation, which is basically a nonprofit think tank in D.C. that they hear a politician say they're going to do something from taxes and tariffs, and they calculate like how much that should cost. And they come out with this report, and it says there's going to be, approximately $80 billion of new taxes and tariffs that could be, paid out as a result of these proposals from Trump. Well, in 2024, we mentioned it earlier in the show, the U.S. government subsidized Ukraine $80 billion with weapons and just cash, right? What would you what would you rather do? Do you want to spend put those tariffs in, take that $80 billion and then give it to, Ukraine to fight a war? Or if you didn't have that war, you could have the tariffs, take the $80 billion and re-inject it into creating jobs and industry for the U.S. economy and for Americans to start producing, cellular products and semiconductors and server stacks and investing in, energy for the U.S. economy. And it's just, it's a real decision to make. And if you commit yourself to the things that the Trump platform has, which is like stopping the war in Ukraine, which would obviously mean stopping subsidizing that war to the tune of $80 billion a year, well, we're saving the $80 billion already, And so if we reinvest it, it already pays for the tariffs. Use it as subsidies to get us all to, if you give me a $400 tax credit to buy a U.S.-made iPhone so that it costs the same as buying one that's assembled in China right now, I'm totally fine with it. It's the same amount of money out of my pocket. So yeah, we'll just leave that where it is. Hopefully, if you have been following along and you did listen to the whole episode, you don't feel totally exhausted, like you just sat through, a lecture on a college campus talking about, macroeconomics and political economy. Hopefully, you feel a little bit, better informed and better understanding how everything is connected in our government between not just the economics or the policies on taxes and trades, but also national security, domestic security, and just basically bringing the U.S. economy up to speed so we can continue to be on the leading edge across all fronts, which is where we want to be, right? Ultimately, we want the U.S. to continue to prosper, Americans to be wealthy. We want Americans to be able to get the best products, the best tech, the coolest gadgets, the best vehicles, everything to be awesome, and also not to go to, in my opinion, to go to war over stuff that has nothing to do with the security of the United States, right? We could just have a much more peaceful, and that would be my hope is that after this pendulum swing over the past, decade plus of Trump in and Trump out and Trump back in, it's showing that the United States and Americans are having real thoughts about if what we've been doing for the last 30 years, 70 years of being in constant warfare all across the globe, from Korea to Panama to, Nicaragua to Vietnam, shadow wars, in other places, the Middle East, multiple times, maybe having a combination of reinvestment and rejuvenation of American industry and economy, as well as no foreign wars for a while is not such a bad deal. But anyway, thanks again for tuning in. I'm going to pull the plug on this follow-on podcast and immediately go over and record. We gotta get started on talking about housing and real estate, right? So we're gonna go do that, and we're gonna get out 2 podcasts this week. And so I thank you for tuning in. If you do want to follow up with me, obviously you can email at the address is coach@military-wealth.com. You can find a link to a contact form on our website, which is www.militarywealthcoach.com. While you're there, please opt in for our weekly newsletter to stay up to date with money tips, blogs, podcasts, as well as you can sign up for a free consultation. We can talk about whatever. And you also find links to all of our socials where you can reach us. The account's usually MWC112358. And you can DM us there with requests for blog posts, show notes, episode ideas, anything else like that. All right, so without wasting any more time, we'll cut this off and say, until next time, which is like in 5 minutes, stay financially fit and mission ready.